Hola estudiantes y buenas. Welcome to another video grammar lesson for the Spanish language. This video lesson is going to be called El Imperfecto with the subtitle of, what was I talking about? Because when you talk about the imperfect tense, that whole idea in the past of was talking, that is kind of what the imperfect tense does. All right, so just like the preterit tense when we learned that one in that video, we had some visual symbols that went with that one, and we're going to have a couple visual symbols that go along with the imperfect tense as well. So first visual symbol that I want to talk about is going to be this wavy timeline with arrows pointing off in both directions. All right, and what's going on here is we are not focused on when something began, and we are not focused on whether or not it ended or when it ended, but we know that when we walked into a scene, this is what was happening. And so that is my kind of translation or interpretation of this one is was, whatever your verb is, plus an ing on the end of it. All right, the other visual symbol that I want to talk about is the recycling symbol. So it's going to look a little bit like this right here. You have a circle with a couple arrows and making it look like it's going around and around. And this is going to be for repeated past action or what you used to do. And so our interpretation of this one is used to plus whatever your verb is. All right, so there are our two visual symbols that I want to talk about. There is a third and less commonly used visual symbol that I use with this one, and it's just the ellipses. All right, so those three dots. What this one would mean is like, yeah, we know when it started, but we don't know if it's over yet. So that would be that would kind of be like a timeline that points off in one direction. So we know when it started, but then we walked out, so it might still be happening. We're not really sure. But the two main ones are the wavy timeline and the recycle symbol. The imperfect tense is one of the simplest tenses to learn in the Spanish language for many reasons, but one of the main reasons is that it is super simple to conjugate in all of its forms. For our regular AR verbs, I call those the aba family, all right, because when I go to conjugate these things, when I go to put it into the yo form, you knock off the AR ending of the verb and you replace it with aba. When you do the to form, you take that same thing, aba, and you just modify that slightly to make it a to form verb. So it's going to be abas. When you do the él, ella, usted form, this one is going to be identical to the yo form, so just aba again. When you put it in the nosotros form, it's going to be habamos. And when you do that one, make sure you get this accent over the A. What's happening is you are adding multiple syllables to the end of this thing. Because of the extra syllables that we're adding onto, it would draw natural stress to this syllable right here. We need to keep our stress the same across all forms of the verb when we conjugate it. And so we need to offset our natural stress with that accent right there. For the vosotros form, you take that aba and add is to it, so abais. And for the ellos form, you're going to take aba and add an n to it, so aban. All right, for our er and ir verbs, we're going to have the same conjugated endings. So that's another thing that makes this a pretty simple concept to learn. When I go into the yo form, I call these guys the ia family because that's what I get in the yo form. Ia ending. And once again, we're going to take that same ending and we're just going to add something else to it to change each person. So the yo form is going to be ia, the to form is ias, the él, ella, usted form is going to be ia, nosotros is going to be íamos, vosotros is going to be iais, and the ellos form is going to be ian. All right, to continue in making the imperfect tense one of the most simple things to learn in the Spanish language, When we talked about conjugation in the present tense, we got through the conjugation 1.0, which was just our regular verbs, and then we got into conjugation 2.0, and those are common irregularities. And we walked into this thing called boot verbs. Okay, if you haven't watched the conjugation 2.0 video, a boot verb is a verb that gets a stem change in the yo form, the to form, the l form, and the ellos form. And in the conjugation chart, if I were to outline that, it would look kind of like a boot. All right, so that's a boot verb. Gets a stem change in these forms, in the highlighted forms of the boot. However, in the imperfect tense, boot verbs don't exist. We have no stem changes in the imperfect tense. All right, the second common irregularity that we talked about in the conjugation 2.0 verbs are what are called, or what are known as, go-go verbs and ZCO verbs. A go-go verb would be like the verb salir, which means to leave or to go out. When you put it in the yo form, instead of just getting an O at the end, it gets a GO. So the handy-dandy rhyme for this one is, in the yo, it gets a go. So that would be salgo. All right, and then these guys, which are very similar to the go-go's, instead of getting a CO, like in the verb conducir. All right, conducir means to drive or to conduct. Normally, you would take the verb up to this point right here. All right, that would be the root of the verb. Get rid of the IR ending and put an O in its place. But these ZCO verbs are actually going to get a Z before you put the C in there. So you got conduzco instead of conduco. All right, so go-go's and Z-cousin verbs, they do not exist in the imperfect tense either. The only other thing we talked about in the conjugation 2.0 video was reflexive verbs. And no matter where you are in the Spanish language, reflexive verbs are going to be a thing. So we do have to worry about these. But since you learned how to do it in the present tense, you chop the se off the end, you swap the order of those two things, and then you quote-unquote conjugate both pieces of it, making them match the subject. We're going to do the exact same thing here in the imperfect tense. If you have a verb that is reflexive, you chop the se off, you put it in the front, you change that se to whatever it's going to be to match the person, but then you also conjugate the verb that comes after it. All right, so a reflexive verb is still just going to be a reflexive verb. All right, so that's those things. No more boot verbs, no more go-go's and ZCO, or as I call them, Z-cousin verbs. We only have reflexive verbs to worry about. But then that brings us to our actual irregular verbs, and there are only 3 of those in the imperfect tense. Those 3 irregular verbs are ser, which means to be, ir, which means to go, and ver, which means to see. All right, with the verb ser, if you're one of my students in my class and you're taking notes on this, I want you at this point in time to just underline the ER, because no matter where you conjugate that thing in the imperfect tense, that ER is coming back to see you. For the verb ir, I want you to do the same thing, but this time with just the letter I. I also want you guys to put a note in there that it's going to conjugate like an AR verb. And that'll make more sense in a second. All right, and then the verb ver, I want you to underline that E right there, because that's its irregularity, is it's going to retain the E. Instead of chopping off the ER from the end and putting a new ending in its place, it's going to keep the E, and then you put the ending after that E. All right, so our verb ser, when we put it into all of its forms, like I told you, underline the ER, it's coming back. We've got era, eras, era, éramos. And remember, we just tacked on a couple extra syllables there, so we need to offset our stress. Erais and eran. Our verb ir, remember the I is staying, but then it's going to kind of conjugate like an AR verb, so it's going to be iba. and then ibas, and then iba. Nosotros form is going to be íbamos. Once again, we tacked on a couple syllables back there, so we need to offset our stress. We've got ibais. And finally, we've got iban. All right, and then our verb ver is going to look pretty normal. Except it's retaining that E right there. So veía, veías, veía, veíamos, veíais, and veían. All right, and those are our only 3 irregular verbs in the imperfect tense. As always, we want to see a couple of these verbs in action in sentences, and so I've written a few sentences up here. The very first one, nosotros jugábamos al béisbol. All right, so I have gone ahead and put in the visual symbols here because this sentence could be interpreted both ways. All right, remember the recycling symbol means it was repeated, so nosotros jugábamos al béisbol could mean we used to play baseball, as in, like, when we were kids, we used to do it a lot. All right, but then we also have the squiggly timeline with arrows pointing off in both directions, which means that when somebody showed up to the scene, what they would have seen there is we were playing baseball. All right, so they don't know when we started. They might have left at some point in time, and we could have kept on playing after that point in time. But from the time that they showed up until the time they left, that's what we were doing. We were playing baseball. All right, next sentence says, ellas comían en McDonald's cada fin de semana. All right, and that idea of cada fin de semana means it was done every weekend. So ellas comían en McDonald's is going to mean they used to eat at McDonald's. And then the last one says, tú le escribías muchas cartas a tu abuela. All right, that idea of muchas cartas means that it was probably done several times in the past, which means it's a repeated past action. You used to write lots of letters to your grandmother. And if we're going to have some sentences with imperfect tense verbs in action, we might as well throw a few of our irregulars in there as well and just see those guys in sentences too. So, Reinaldo era un niño muy atrevido. All right, so this idea of Reinaldo being a pretty daring child, we don't know when it started, we don't know when it ended, but we know that when he was a kid, all right, we're not focusing on a start or end point, he used to be a pretty daring child. All right, next one, ellas veían muchas películas en el cine. That idea of muchas películas means that it was done probably multiple times. They used to watch many movies at the cinema. And then finally, the last sentence, yo iba a la playa cada verano. The idea of cada verano means every summer. So this is something we used to do over and over and over again. So I used to go to the beach every summer. And there you have it, guys. That is the whole video on the imperfect tense. Once again, pretty simple tense. You have 2 families, the abas and the ias. You only have 3 irregulars and none of those common irregularities that we would have seen in the present tense. And so this is a pretty simple concept to learn. Thanks a lot, guys, for joining me for another grammar lesson. If you have any questions, feel free to drop those questions in the comments. If you are in my class and you want to ask me a question in class, please, by all means, do so. Muchas gracias, muchachos, y hasta luego. See you guys in the next one.